today. You know, I love teaching, but I don't necessarily break it down into what I'm teaching because it's all very interrelated. But my first thought was the 10 most important things about water and paint, but it's more than 10, and it's not just about water and paint. But these are some of my really important things about watercolor, and a lot of you have heard some of them before. It has to do with water, and it has to do with a lot of things. So I'm going to spotlight my tabletop. Okay, welcome. I'll be back soon. I'm here. So one thing that's really important, you can see by the shine and everything else, my paints are very wet. They're the consistency of toothpaste, right? And they are always that way. So if I find they're drying up, and part of the reason they're always that way is they are Holbein. That's the brand. And I just find that these stay stickier. There are ones that have honey in them, and maybe Graham makes them, maybe those are also, but they don't have oxgall. And so they do, if I don't paint for 3 or 4 weeks, they may harden into a hard cake. And then I can spray them and activate them. But the problem is when you spray dry paints to activate them, all you're activating is the surface, right? And so you still have to dig for pigment. And I think that one of the big takeaways I have when I talk to students is it's really important that the pigment be juicy. And it's very hard to get that juicy pigment if you're wetting a hard cake and just trying to get the paint, and then you finally, okay, I got enough on my brush, right? So that to me is a huge thing. Okay, and okay, so that's like number one. The other thing is to understand how the paints work, right? And how the brush works. So brush works. Okay, so when you wet a brush, you dip the whole thing in water, and what happens is you're filling this part of the brush. And I know some of you have heard this from me before, but it is, people hear it, and then all of a sudden sometimes they get it, right? So this part that's filled is here, and this is the tip. So when I'm going to go and apply paint, I'm going to take some paint, whatever color I'm going to use, and I'll use a nice dark color for this. So, so what I do is when my paints feel like they've dried up a little, I take and squirt another little bit of the pigment on top, right? And it kind of reactivates what's underneath too. So instead of just spraying them, if they're really dry, I might spray them, but I also might just squirt out new paint right on top of them. That's also an excellent opportunity when they're kind of dry and they have like a little skin on them. I take a wet paper towel and just wipe the top of them. And usually a little skin comes off with the junk and the dirt. And then I have kind of clean paint and I squeeze some on top of it. So you can see, like in my yellow ochre, you can see that I squeezed a little drop on top last night, right? So in order to use my paint, and again, this is kind of 101, but I think it bears repeating. I'll take this paint, this happens to be Prussian blue, and I'll put it in the palette area, and I'll put whatever paint I'm going to use. If I'm going to use, maybe I'm going to be making a green, then I might also take, this is actually, if you know me, it looks green now, but it's only green because it's a yellowish, right? It's green because I had some on, but I'll put several of the colors that I might end up using on my palette in this area, in this mixing area, okay? Then you saw I dipped into the water and I wet my brush. Now, if you can see, the top part of my brush is kind of clear, the bottom has the paint on it. And that's the key, is that wet part is feeding, right? So it's like a fountain pen, right? The water is in here and it's going through the paint and it's dispensing the paint on the paper. And that's something people don't understand, that the water is really in here. So if I'm in the middle of something and I dip into the water again, I'm kind of losing whatever was on this brush rather than extending it. Sometimes people have a wash and they feel it's not covering enough and they'll dip in. And so you just have to be aware it's going to lighten it, but it's going to extend it, right? If I fill my brush well, all right, so I'm dipping it again and then I'm dipping in my pigment. If I fill my brush well, it's going to last quite a long time, right? And that's another one of my tips, is that you want to keep the water, you don't want to have to go back into a wash. So the more paint I can load my brush with, the better results I have. And so, any questions? Does it make sense? This
Yes.
is something you've heard before, but is it new in a way, right? It's showing you, you know, it's putting words to it in a way. So the other part that, again, I have ad nauseum, right? If you're going to learn one thing for me, it's the beaded wash, okay? And along with the beaded wash is the thing, do not go back into an area until it's dry, or if it's very wet, and that's another thing we'll talk about, okay? So here I'm making my wash. So I always work on an angle, and I'm gonna see if I could move the camera. I may collapse on me. All right, can you see? So do you see this dark area, right? So it's lighter here and it's darker here. And that dark is where the paint, I'm gonna move it up here, how about that? Okay, so when I do this, you see this dark area. That's the pool of the paint. That's what we call the bead. And when I'm painting from that area, right? And I'm always painting from that area. If I need more of the color, and hopefully I've mixed enough of a puddle on my paper that I have it, I can go back in, and this is called feeding the bead, right? It's actually, if I have to walk away or something, I'm going to feed the bead slightly so that I have paint, so that that edge doesn't dry, right? I'm always working from a wet part of the paint. And that's just really important, because, and the thing I see happening is someone will be working like this and they'll see, oh my gosh, it's so much lighter up here and darker here. So they'll go back and try to work on that area. And the thing is, that's only lighter because it's dried a little bit, right? So you don't want to go back into the bead until, you know, until it's very dry. There are exceptions, and I'll show you those exceptions, okay? So you're working from the wet edge of the paint, and it doesn't matter that you're doing this. The same thing could happen if I'm painting some weird shape, right? The same thing is happening, that I'm working from the edge. Now, if I want to change the color, then I might dip into another color there, but I'm working from the edge, right? If there's a graduation, or if I want it to go lighter, then I can dip into water and work from that edge. When I get to the bottom of an edge and there's a lot of paint, then I dry my brush and I simply pick up the thirsty, you know, a thirsty brush, pick up the edge. Now, another one of my rules is don't blot. All right, so let me, so don't blot, right? Because people go, well, you've disrupted the flow of the paint, right? My number one rule is to know, I've given you like 8 number one rules, right? But is to know what the materials do and use that instead of trying to create, right? So I'm gonna come up a little so I don't hit myself in the head. Let's see if I can get this to stay. All right. So I don't want to hit my, I don't want to get in my own way. I want to learn what the pigment does. So when And I think people have seen me do this before. I'm going to try to take a clean brush and a clean set of water. Okay, so there are two wonderful examples. One is if I want to paint around, that's a house and a sky and a tree, okay? All right. All right, so there are two things I want to be aware of. One is, now I don't think you can see what I just did. You can see the motion of the brush, right? I made a spiral. If I take the pigment and I put it in that wet part, people are always amazed. The pigment follows the water, right? So if I know that, I'm going to use that to my advantage. Okay. So it will only go where there's water, which means there are many times I do not mask. Okay. To me, painting is not a coloring book. All right. And so I don't necessarily draw. I do a very detailed drawing, you know, but I don't necessarily stay within the lines. So if this is a house and a tree, one of the things I might do is I'm going to see what area. All right, so I do a sky, and you know, often I'll do this, where I'll just paint with water along the edge, right? So this is going to be wet on wet. Now I'm going over my tree because my tree is green and green has blue in it, right? Now, how wet do I make it? You see how shiny in the camera, you can really see the shine of the water. Yes. And so that shine, I want to wait, depending on how diffuse I want it, but I'm going to wait till it gets just a little less shiny. And you start to know about the shine, right? That's something you just have to start to experience, and then you'll know it. So, so if I take paint now in here for my sky, you'll notice I don't have to worry. It stops at the roof line, right? So that's how I can use the water to control the paint. By leaving a dry area, I don't have a problem. Now here's an exception, okay? Let's pretend this isn't a sky, it's something else. It's still extremely wet. It's still shiny, right? So I can put a little bit of another color in it if I want. So this isn't going to look like a sky, but I'm going to put magenta so you could see it. And I'm going to charge it, right? And I'm going to put a little bit of magenta in and then get out of the way and let it spread a little, okay? And I can even come back and put in a little water if I want. Now that's wet into wet painting. Why does that work and not blossom when I tell you not to go into a wash until it's totally dry? The reason it's wet and doesn't blossom, it is for two reasons. One is I dried my brush and I had less pigment to water ratio on my brush. So there is, I wish I could credit the right person. I'm not sure who it is, but who goes through and does a diagram of the different mixtures. And he considers one like tea, coffee, milk, right? All those things have different thicknesses. I don't know if it's not viscosity, it's different thicknesses. And if you start to think of your paint that way, then you could put like a milk, you know, you can have a milk kind of mixture that goes into a tea mixture, and it won't be as likely to blossom. But you want to do that very liberally, very not liberally, the opposite. You want to do that very cautiously, right? So you're not adding a lot of you know, you're not, and if you notice, I didn't start brushing, right? I'm just charging. So that's kind of called charging a wash. If I have a wash and it's one color, let me pick another color so you can really see it, right? And I want it to have some other little colors in it, I can just put tiny bits of that color in it, right? And the water is even still moving around, so I can even move it around a little bit. Now, when would I use a wet on wet approach? When it's something that is amorphous, right? So if I were trying to do fog, that would be a perfect thing to do. I might wet, if it was a very foggy painting, I might wet the entire page, right? If I wet the entire page and then wait, again, the real trick is learning when it's going to be wet enough. So I'm wetting it, I'm actually wetting it. I skipped a step because I just wet it with a really weak tint, right? And then I have to let it dry for a minute. Talk among yourselves. But then you can see if I draw a line, maybe it's a little tree line, it's going to start to spread, and I have to wait. You know, there's patience involved with this because it's going to start. Can you see it's starting to bleed a little bit, right? And how much it bleeds depends on how wet the paper is. So if you start to play with different mixtures of water and different wetnesses, right, then that's how I can get a foggy, soft edge, right? And that works really well. So other places in a foggy, if I had a background and I was kind of nervous about painting it this way and getting, if I needed a fairly even patch, or even a variegated patch, but I didn't want like blossoms on it, I might wet the background around something and then paint on it, right? And leave the subject. So if I painted a flower, right? And I wanted to do a background around that flower, this page is getting, I can either use a very wet, this case my water is no longer clean, but that's good because you can see it, right? And then I can add whatever color I want in there, maybe it's a pink, right? And it'll flow, and I can move my paper to get it to flow the way I want it to, right? It's gonna give me probably a little bit of a, not a solid a feeling, but an overall color, right? And in the places here, I can sop up those little beaded edges with my thirsty brush. And it's a pretty easy way to get a big area of color. I have a student whose work I love, but one of the things I find is a lot of times she does these gorgeous washes. And so with water, the other thing is to use gravity. So what's interesting is a lot of her shapes end up having like a little line around them. And part of it is I was watching to see how she did that, because sometimes it works, but a lot of times you don't want that. Maybe it flattens out something. And what I found is she'll work with a wet wash like this, and she'll always keep moving it around, and she never leaves it in the same direction. So of course what happens is that bead, that last little bit of pigment, ends up all around the outside of the shape, if that makes any sense. Making sense? So in a way it defeats the purpose. That's why I like to work on an angle. I will pick up my paper and do this, especially if I'm doing a big painting with the sky, you know, I'll do something, it's taped to a board and I paint the sky and I'll go like to encourage the paint to move, right? And I can also spray it to encourage the paint to move, right? If it's wet. But so that's another thing about water. Don't go back into a wash, right? Do not go back into a wash until it's dry. That medium place is a deadly place, right? Usually, see, this has little dots. If I had tried to clean up those little dots while it was wet, they'd have blossoms everywhere. So I want to wait till it's completely dry, and then I could probably give it another coat, right? I may even decide those little specks that while I'm doing it seem to me so disturbing aren't so disturbing, right? A lot of times we panic. So I guess another rule is don't panic too much, right? Actually, I didn't even write that down. One of my things is have patience, don't panic. Let it dry before you decide it's a problem, right? Because watercolor is a process and it has to do with water and drying. And if we panic too quickly, then we miss that sense of, you know, of what really might happen there. I don't know if I've done 10 things. Beat and wash, don't go back into a wash. If you're adding more pigment, more color, use more pigment to water. Keep your paints wet. I'm going out of order here. Use your water, know how your brush uses water, okay? Don't blot. The first stroke is the most important. I don't know if I went over that, but the first stroke is really the most important. So when you're laying down paint, that's going to be the most beautiful kind of washy. That's a terrible color and it didn't have a lot of pigment, but so I don't want to disturb that if I can, you know. I really want to, as much as possible, leave that thing and do this, you know, rather than keep reworking and reworking and reworking. So some areas, there are some people that go in very light everywhere and then darken areas. I like to try to sometimes just go in for it, you know, as dark. Sometimes when it dries, it's not dark enough and I go back in, but don't be afraid to put in a dark wash right away where it belongs. So, okay, so I think that that is really everything that I can think about to tell you about water.